Welcome to the September edition of the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative and University of Minnesota Extension's 2020 Forestry Webinar Series. For those of you who don't know me yet, possibly you've seen my name floating around in some of these webinars, or maybe we've communicated over email, but my name is Caitlin Wilson, and I work with Eli at SFEC as the Education Program Specialist. I started in early June, but this is my first time hosting a webinar, so I'm excited about that, and I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see all of you here today. Before we dive in, just a couple quick things. So a quick announcement about next month's webinar. We'll be hearing from Mike Dockery of the University of Minnesota's Department of Forest Resources on practical applications of an Indigenous model of sustainability. So I hope to see all of you there again on October 20th. And whether you plan to attend or not, you can also check out episode 7 of the Camp 8 podcast, in which Eli and Mike talk about Indigenous models of sustainability. And additionally, episode 12 just dropped yesterday. Eli spoke with Eric Schenk, the executive director of the Minnesota Forest Resources Council. So I also recommend tuning into that and checking out the podcast in general if you haven't had the opportunity to do so yet. Again, welcome to our September webinar titled Emerald Ash Borer Current Status, Trends, and New Resources for Landowners and Managers. I'm very excited to introduce John Osthus from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and Matt Russell from the University of Minnesota Department of Forest Resources. John's going to kick us off today with discussing the status, trends, distribution, and quarantine updates related to EAB. And then Matt will provide us an update on extension efforts and new resources for private landowners seeking to manage ash woodlands. So some quick bookkeeping before I hand it over. If you're interested in getting continuing education credit for today, please watch for the link in the chat at the end of the webinar. If you miss it there, don't worry. When you close out of the webinar, you'll automatically be redirected to the request form when you close the webinar. So don't forget, you need to complete that request in order to get credit for the webinar today. If you have any questions or comments for John or Matt anytime during the webinar, feel free to type those into the chat. You don't have to wait until the end. Just send them in whenever they come to your mind. Sending them publicly so that all of the panelists and attendees can view them is best. But if you'd rather send them to me, Caitlin Wilson, privately, that's also fine. We will stop in between John and Matt's presentations for 5 minutes for some time for questions. But don't worry, if you have a question that doesn't get answered then, we will have some more time at the end. So again, welcome to our September webinar. Welcome, John and Matt. And without further ado, John, take it away.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. Just share my screen here, 1 second. All right, everyone. I'm John Osthus with the Minnesota Department of Ag. I work in the Plant Protection Division and specifically in the Pest Detection and Export Certification Unit. So we're charged with doing basically statewide surveys for invasive insect pests and plant diseases to help with our agricultural exports and anything that could cause environmental harm. So I'll give you kind of a brief overview of the status of emerald ash borer in Minnesota and just kind of an overview of what the pest is. And then I'll give you an update on our biological control operations that we've been doing for about a decade. So I'll get started here. As many of you probably know, emerald ash borer is from northern China, parts of Mongolia, the Russian Far East, Japan, and North and South Korea. That's its native range. And it was first detected in North America in Detroit, Michigan, and the Windsor, Ontario area in 2002. It likely arrived via solid wood packing material through the ports there and likely arrived sometime in the early 90s. And so from there, populations built up unknowingly, and then it's spread through the U.S. quite quickly, especially the eastern half of the U.S. Because of infested firewood and infested nursery stock that got shipped out. So just a brief background of the life cycle of emerald ash borer. It's a metallic wood-boring beetle. The adult beetles are active from May through September. So the beetles typically emerge between mid-May and mid-June, depending where you are in the state of Minnesota. So in the southern part of Minnesota, it's probably going to be right around that second or third week of May. And up in, like, say, Duluth and north central Minnesota, that would be more towards the middle of June by the time you reach emergence. So once the adult beetles emerge, they do a little bit of maturation feeding. So it's a few days feeding on the leaves. It's nothing that you would notice in the canopy. And then they mate, and then the females lay their eggs in the bark crevices and underneath the bark flaps on the ash trees. And so they typically start on branches and stems that are between 3 and 6 inches in diameter, and they work their way down the tree. So they start in the mid to upper canopy. So the average female lays between 60 to 90 eggs in her lifetime and can lay upwards of 200. So you can see how populations can build very quickly once you have a few females out there laying lots of eggs. And so once those eggs hatch, about a week later after being laid, the little neonate larva begins to chew through the bark and then starts its feeding gallery on the phloem of the trees. And so the larva goes through 4 instar stages, basically just the size of the larva, and then eventually chewing a pupal chamber. And so they chew that pupal chamber either a quarter inch into the sapwood, or on really large mature trees on the trunk, they'll do that into the bark as well. Once they make it to that pupal chamber, they're done feeding on the phloem, and then once it heats up again, they will pupate and emerge as an adult and start the process all over again. In Minnesota, we do have a 1-year and 2-year life cycle. So just to give you an example of the 2-year life cycle, the farther northern in Minnesota you get, the more percentage of the larvae that are making it out in 2 years instead of 1. And so egg that was laid in 2019, it hatched, the larva made it through 1 or 2 instars before it got too cold, overwintered, and then the spring, summer of 2020, it made its way through the rest of its larval instar stages and into the pupal chamber, and then the summer of 2021, it will emerge as an adult beetle. So that just gives you an example of that. So at any time throughout the year, you can basically have any larval instar stage underneath the bark. And EAB kills trees basically by strength in numbers. I mean, trees can handle an attack by a few emerald ash borer, but once there's more and more eggs laid on the tree, the number of larvae build up. You go from a few to thousands, and it cuts off the nutrient transport between the roots in the canopy. So it is a strength in numbers. Our host trees in Minnesota, we have 3 types. We have black ash, green ash, and white ash. As you can see on that map, green ash is found throughout the entire state of Minnesota. Black ash is in 2/3 and is our largest ash resource in the state, especially in north central Minnesota. And then we have pockets of white ash on the eastern part of the state. They are all highly susceptible to emerald ash borer. We also have a secondary host called the white fringe tree. It's in the same family as ash, in the all family, and it's not native to Minnesota, but occasionally you will find it planted in people's yards and in landscaped areas. So not a great shrub to plant anymore. And recognizing emerald ash borer, I'll just briefly go through the signs and symptoms that you look for and how to positively identify it. The S-shaped gallery is indicative of emerald ash borer. So if you find that kind of tight S-shaped curve on the surface of the wood of the insect feeding gallery, and it's in an ash tree, you know it's emerald ash borer. There are other native agralis that will attack birch trees or oak trees or poplar trees that will make that same type of gallery, but if you find it in an ash tree, you know it's emerald ash borer. And similar to that, if you find the actual insect larva in the tree, in that gallery, you can look for 2 little spine-like projections on the tail end of that. You can see that circled in the picture. It's called the Urogomphie. And so if you find a larva in an ash tree that has those 2 spine-like projections, you know it's emerald ash borer. There's other native insects that will have one of those or none of those, but if you find them with those 2 spine-like projections, you know you have emerald ash borer. The other 2 ways to confirm it are the D-shaped exit holes and the adult beetles. Now, these 2 are the least likely method from which you would probably confirm an emerald ash borer infestation. With the D-shaped exit holes, they're small, they're hard to spot, and if you can see them at eye level, there's probably a lot of other damage in the tree if you look up. So that is one that we don't suggest spending much time looking for. And if you do find one that you think is a D-shaped egg hole and you have permission to remove the bark from the tree, you're better off to take the bark off and look for the insect gallery underneath. And it's really not something that you come across that often unless you're really looking hard. And same with the adult beetle. I mean, they're usually up in the canopies. You have to be in a pretty heavily infested area to notice much EAB flying around. It's a lot of times people in the spring will see 6-spotted tiger beetles run across their sidewalk or their deck, and they see a shiny green iridescent beetle and think it's emerald ash borer. But those two, you can confirm in that way, but it's just kind of the least likely way it'll happen. So signs and symptoms, what you want to look for when you're trying to detect emerald ash borer early. The main ways we do this is with woodpecker damage and bark splits. So like I had mentioned, emerald ash borer typically starts in the mid to upper canopy. And in many cases, they start on the southwest facing side of the tree where it gets the most sunlight. And so they infest those 3 to 6 inch diameter branches first. And once the woodpeckers in the area find the food source, they can really help illuminate what's going on. And so we look with nice high-powered binoculars for basically small dime-sized oval-shaped woodpeck holes that just go just to the surface of the wood. So it's going just deep enough to get that emerald ash borer larva on the surface of the wood. And so a lot of times the woodpeckers will scrape off some outer bark, or what we call blonding. And so you'll see that kind of contrast difference up in the canopy, and then you take a closer look to see if there's any actual woodpeck holes to show you that the woodpecker found an insect underneath the bark right there. And there's a lot of times enough bark will be knocked off to where you can actually see the emerald ash borer gallery if you have nice binoculars. So that is what we've found to be the most effective method when looking for emerald ash borer in the early stages before it's widespread and you can actually see tree mortality. Another symptom to look for is bark splits. And so, you know, the first few emerald ash borer that infest a tree, the tree can kind of heal around it. It'll build up callus tissue. Then as that tree continues to grow, the bark that was attached where the emerald ash borer feeding gallery was will then split open as that tree grows, and you can sometimes see that nice gallery on the surface of the wood within that bark split. So I do see that a lot on black ash. You'll see it plenty on green and white ash as well, but it seems to be a very prominent symptom on black ash. Another thing to look for is canopy thinning. So a lot of times when you find an infestation, if the woodpeckers haven't found that food source yet, you'll see kind of overall canopy thinning, and you'll see it in a lot of ash trees in an area. And so this is just it's an overall thinning. So you have fewer leaves, you have smaller leaves, and you have more light coming through. It's not just, say, a dead branch in the crown. It's an overall thinning. So it's another thing that you can look for early signs of an infestation. Distribution. So I'll quickly go over what we have in the U.S. Right now, emerald ash borer is found in 35 U.S. states and 5 Canadian provinces. So you see it's really spread throughout much of the native range of ash at this point. And you also notice that you have Colorado out there to the west. Emerald ash borer didn't fly on its own to Colorado. That's really just shows you how quickly things can move when you're moving infested firewood or nursery stock around the country. Emerald ash borer on its own, can fly, up to 5+ miles, but on average, they usually don't go more than 100 meters from the tree that they emerged from. So typically, emerald ash borer will reinfest the same tree or a tree nearby. It's just a small percentage of the population that will strike out several miles to start a new infestation. Here in Minnesota, we right now are at 23 counties that are infested. The most recent counties were Rice County and Mower County. So Rice County is where just kind of south of the cities there where Northfield and Faribault are. So the infestation was found in Faribault. And then Mower County is down in the southeast, kind of down by Lanesboro on the Iowa border, where Austin, Minnesota is in there. And so you'll notice that's about 25% of the counties in Minnesota, but many of these counties, the infestations are still pretty early on, so it's just a small part of land in that county that has an infestation going. So there's still many things that can be done to mitigate and reduce the rate of spread, and so you give other neighboring communities more time until emerald ash borer will reach there. Right now, we're going at about 50% of the national spread rate of emerald ash borer. So we're doing better than many others, and that's one positive takeaway from this. That picture on the right of the map, that is our EAB status map. So if you go to MDA's EAB webpage, you can click on the link for our interactive map. You can zoom into the nearest known infestation to your address. We also provide those green polygons. There is what we deem the generally infested area. And so we put a buffer around known infested tree points, knowing that emerald ash borer is already further beyond what you can visually see as far as damage goes. So if you're a homeowner or something like that, and you're within that green polygon or real near it, you should be deciding what you're going to do with your ash trees. And so I will say the polygons are pretty accurate for a lot of the new counties, but as you get into the southeastern part of the state where we have fewer people reporting things and kind of more rural farmland, it's probably more further progressed to the west, kind of down there past Rochester and in that far southeastern part of the state where EAB infestations are really high and there's high beetle pressure. Like I was saying before, so our best management practices, EAB adult beetles are active May through September, so it's best to avoid removing ash branches, trees, stumps. Try not to do work on ash trees so you're not pushing beetles that would have reinfested that same tree to new trees and further out, and or have the potential to have beetles fly out of your load if you're transporting it to a processing facility. So when possible, do work on ash trees from October through April when the adult beetles are not active. That way, if you have to move the material off site, you can get it to a facility where it can be processed prior to the flight season. And in general, don't move firewood. That's our main message. Besides emerald ash borer, there's other things that can be brought to new locations that way. And a cut pile of firewood, emerald ash borer can emerge from cut firewood, over a year after it's been cut. So it's really important to try to burn it where you buy it, and not move firewood long distances. Reporting is key. So the more knowledgeable eyes we have throughout the state, the better off we'll be. If you see something that you think is emerald ash borer, please report it. Take pictures if you can, take detailed notes, capture the insect or the larva if that's what you found, and then contact either a city forester, or you can contact us at Arrest the Pest email or the voicemail number. We also like reports that come through the Gledin app, the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app. That's really slick because you can generate the report. It prompts you to take a picture, and it takes a GPS coordinate so we know exactly where that report came from. And it has your email address attached to it, so it's easy to follow up on. That goes directly to my email, so that is the slickest way to report something in the state. And like I said, with pictures, if you take pictures, please take detailed pictures of what you're seeing that makes you think it's emerald ash borer. I don't want zoomed out pictures of just a crappy looking ash tree. All right, so biological control. The MDA has been doing biological control since 2010. We first started doing releases in the far southeastern part of the state along the Mississippi River there on the islands, just north of the Iowa border. Just to go over classical biological control, which is what this is, the goal is to reduce the pest population to an acceptable level. We're not going to be able to eradicate this pest. And so what we usually have in classical biological control, you have a pest that builds up population, begins causing damage, and then you come in at a lag time with a bioagent release, and it takes time for that population to build up to the pest population size to then bring it down in numbers and hopefully cycle at some level that's acceptable below a certain damage threshold. And so we are releasing 3 types of parasitoid wasps. One is an egg parasitoid, and 2 are larval parasitoids. These are highly host-specific bioagents. So they went through a number of years of host specificity testing in quarantine facilities out east. The USDA, after emerald ash borer was found, went to northern China and the Russian Far East to look for natural enemies of emerald ash borer. And so these are the ones that they've okayed for release. And really they're really host specific. You have to have EAB present for them to be able to establish and complete their life cycle. The egg parasitoid Obvious goes up and down the bark crevices and bark cracks searching for emerald ash borer eggs. And then they insert their egg into the emerald ash borer egg, and then it kills the egg and develops and emerges from there. On average, it can parasitize, up to 60 eggs, but usually about 24 in their lifetime, single Obvious. And then Strasticus is a larval endoparasitoid. They insert their eggs inside the emerald ash borer larva, so it's the late instar larva that they attack. It's the third and fourth instars that they will go after, and so they'll insert their eggs into that emerald ash borer larva, and then it'll develop from the inside and feed on the emerald ash borer larva from the inside out, killing it. This is our most successful parasitoid so far, but you'll notice it's small. It's about 3 millimeters in big, where the egg parasitoid is only about 1 millimeter. And it has a short ovipositor, so it can't get through really thick bark. It can only get through kind of the smaller diameter trees, and does really well in those kind of 1 to 2 inch saplings and those smaller, 5 to 8 inch diameter trees. And our newest parasitoid is Spathius galenae, and that's from the Russian Far East. It's about 4 millimeters big on average. So these are all very small stuff that you won't encounter out in the environment. And this is a larval ectoparasitoid. So it'll paralyze the emerald ash borer larva and then lay its eggs on the outside of it, where they'll then feed on the larva and develop. And so that has that longer ovipositor and can get through most bark thicknesses. So we're really hoping this can establish, and based on where it came from, there's a good chance it's better climate matched as well. So after all that, they decided and they came out with an environmental assessment finding no significant impact to other native wood borers or the environments. And so the risk of EAB is far greater than the risk of the introduction of these biological control agents. So far here in Minnesota, we've released over 620,000 parasitoids across 46 sites in 11 counties. And much of that has been centered kind of along the Mississippi River corridor from the southeast to the Twin Cities metro. This summer, 7 sites have received over 13,000 parasitoids divided between them. This is a fair bit lower than previous years, and that's due to the rearing facility running at half staff due to the pandemic. So unfortunately, that has cut numbers, and they're doing their best in providing cooperators with parasitoids. The facility is located in Brighton, Michigan, and it's been online since about 2007, run by USDA APHIS. Here's a map of our biological control release locations. You'll notice how they're clustered. We do try to get into kind of the leading edge of infestations and into new locations as they pop up. We try because we want to get them established so it can move with EAB as it moves into new areas. So you'll see a lot of that along the Mississippi River, down there in Winona County and Houston counties. Then we have a site just south of Rochester on kind of the edge of the infestation there. A new site this year is up in Rockville, Minnesota in Stearns County. That one is actually on private property. So a lot of this has been on public property, but we will also do releases on private property if you have a large section of woods that has the appropriate characteristics. And we have been doing releases in Duluth as well, up in Hartley Park and kind of in the Central Hillside area as well in Lincoln and Central Parks. Parasitoids are established in the Twin Cities and in the southeastern part of the state. So that's where we've done the bulk majority of the intensive sampling. So we recover these through a variety of different methods, but the main ones being the 3 below. It's sampling small trees and using a draw knife to strip off layers of bark to find the emerald ash borer galleries and look for the parasitoids within them. We also do bark sifting, where we collect the outer bark of trees that show signs of infestation, and then sift that bark and go through the fine debris to look for emerald ash borer eggs, which are about 1 millimeter in size. And then we also do yellow pan trapping in the summer, and that's set up about 15 yellow pan traps in a transect at a site. And then we collect those samples weekly, and we freeze them, and we go through them in the fall and winter months. So here's just a map of the southeast. So this map is an interactive map that you can find on our EAB Biocontrol webpage on the MDA's website. You can zoom into an area, you can click on them, and it'll pop up more information. So this is kind of Winona County area. You'll see a lot of the finds. We're at Great River Bluff State Park in that far southeastern corner, the city of Winona, and then in the Whitewater WMA and Whitewater State Park area in the western side of Winona County. And a lot of that sampling is just where we've done a lot of releases, and it's easy access to sampling trees as well. And so in the metro, a lot of the sampling has been done at Fort Snelling State Park and kind of near there along the Mississippi River. So you'll see a lot of our recoveries are at those locations. We've also had other recoveries at Hidden Falls and Wheelock Parkway and other parts of the city. So our current status right now, nationally, the introduced parasitoids are causing anywhere from 20 to 80% parasitism of EAB larvae, and that's in ash saplings that are 1 to 2 inch in diameters and young trees that are kind of 5 to 8 inch in diameter. And so that's the data they have coming out of Michigan and a few parts of the northeastern U.S. And those are locations where a lot of the federal researchers are located. Here in Minnesota, the parasitoids are establishing, they are increasing in population, and we're working with U of M to measure that impact. And so I will say we did take a hit the other winter when it got really, really cold. So not this winter, but the winter before, polar vortex. Parasitoids definitely took a big hit, and there was a high level of mortality. So it's going to take a few years for those populations to rebound. But with the parasitoids taking a hit, emerald ash borer also took a hit as well. But that's nothing that's going to eradicate it, but it's helpful when those populations can be reduced some through cold weather. Kind of the Minnesota outlook. So we have been conducting releases and intensive sampling over the last 10 years. We are just finishing up our LCCMR project, and that's a co-project with the University of Minnesota. So hopefully with a couple of sites that we did that intense sampling, we'll have percent parasitism at those sites. So that would be Fort Snelling and the Whitewater WMA area. And our biocontrol work in the state has been funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund since 2011. And so that funding just ended here at the end of June because we got 3 cycles of funding for that. Going forward, now that we don't have the extra amount of funding from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, MDA will still continue coordinating the release of parasitoids, and we'll do parasitoid recovery work when feasible, and mostly just to show establishment in new counties and new areas. We'll continue to find suitable sites for release. We'll work with local partners. If people have private property that would be well suited for it, we're open to that as well. So anybody can contact me if they believe they have a good site. Obviously, you have to have emerald ash borer present. And we will try to do releases in each county that's possible. Obviously, not every county is going to have sites that are good for that. What we're looking for? Well, we're looking for forested areas, woodlots, wooded wetlands, and riparian areas that will not be harvested for at least 5 years. So we want to give time for those parasitoids to get established. Typically, the site should be at least 40 acres in size and have a high density of ash. But if you have ash corridors and connect it to other woodlots, it doesn't have to be exactly 40 acres or anything. And sites should generally consist of 25% ash or higher. Other characteristics you need, we are looking for low to moderate levels of EAB. So we don't want super infested areas where the majority of the trees are going to die within a couple of years. We need time for the parasitoids to build up population with EAB as it builds in the area. And we need forested areas with varying ash size class because, like I said, the one larval parasitoid doesn't do good with very thick bark, so you need both the small and large trees. If it's just a mature ash stand, that might be hard to get them established in those areas. And with that, that's what I got. I just want to acknowledge our funders and cooperators that have helped us do this work so far, and I'll take any questions you might have.
Great, thanks, John. We've only had one question so far, and it was asking if it was possible to get some wasps for release. This was earlier in the talk, so it sounds like you've addressed some of that at the end, but if you want to just
Right.
add
So
anything to that.
if you have an emerald ash borer infested area that meets kind of those release site characteristics, we can work with you to use it as a release site. And you can just, by contacting me, I can work through it with you. We are looking this fall, once all the leaves drop, we will be looking for our sites for next year. So we're trying to add at least 5 sites, because the rearing facilities, since they're at half staff, they want new sites entered sooner than later. And we're going to try to have that done by December for the following season.
Great, thank you. One more just came in. Joel asks, any new info on cold weather slowing EAB spread?
Right, so cold weather can play a role in reducing the EAB populations, but you can't count on that. So really you have to get to negative 29 degrees Fahrenheit underneath the bark to cause a really large scale mortality. And to just give you an idea, that the Twin Cities that last cold snap 2 years ago, got down to negative 24, negative 25. And that we went out and we measured mortality by peeling infested trees. And that we saw, kind of around 60% mortality. And, that's going to vary on a very site-by-site basis, depending on, level of snowpack, whether the trees are located next to other buildings. Like, there's a lot of microsite characteristics that can change the level of mortality in a specific tree. In Stearns County, so up in Sauk Center, where we have an infestation right off I-94, we did measure much higher mortality because we got to negative 32 Fahrenheit air temperature out there. So that we saw closer to 80 or 90% mortality, which is fantastic. But it takes a couple years of moderate winters for that population to catch back up. So while it's helpful for managers, it'll eventually lead to the same outcome with large-scale tree mortality. It's something you can't count on and shouldn't change your overall management strategies at this point.
Perfect. So we've had 2 more come in. We'll answer those, and then we'll move into Matt's presentation and address any more at the end. So one is, have you done sampling in nearby stands to determine if the populations of the parasitoids have spread naturally?
So yeah, we've found the larval parasitoid Tetrascus over 5 miles from the nearest release point. And just to address that Stearns County question, all of Stearns County is under quarantine. We do quarantines at the county level, except for St. Louis County, since it's such a large county. We didn't want to quarantine that whole county and allow movement throughout that entire area that would potentially help spread EAB faster to the large black ash stands farther north in the county.
Perfect, thank you. We did have 1 more come in. I do see that, and I have that recorded, and we'll get to that at the end. But for now, thank you, John. Matt, if you want to take the stage.
Great. Just let me move things around here. Just 1 minute. I've got somehow I can't click on things when other windows are open. Okay. Well, thank you to Caitlin and Eli for the invitation to present here. This was a fun presentation to think about because it's really thinking about some new resources that are available, in particular for landowners and managers. And so I do want to point out that these slides are available. This Z link down here at the bottom, if you want to follow along, feel free to type that in and follow along with these slides. I do have a lot of links. Don't expect you to write all those down by hand, but all of them are linked in the Google Slides that I'll be presenting now. Like Jonathan said, Minnesota is home to 3 ash species. These are the primary ones that we think about when we think about ash in our forests in Minnesota. White ash, really common in southeast central parts of the state, really in the more mesic forests. Green ash, more on upland sites, particularly in southern Minnesota. And the one that we're really concerned about in northern forests is black ash, particularly as they dominate these wet and very wet native plant communities. Black ash is the most abundant ash species in Minnesota. So a lot of the research that I'll be talking about has really focused on black ash, but to a lesser extent, the other two species as well. The short story is that Minnesota has a lot of ash. We just recently finished off a mapping effort looking at detecting ash across Minnesota forests. And we found, and through FIA data, we know that ash is almost 10% of all the trees in Minnesota. So that's a really significant resource that's at risk, particularly when we think about emerald ash borer. If we look at the FIA data, the forest inventory and analysis data, we know that ash is a component on at least 4.3 million acres of forest land in Minnesota. And so that means that it's at least half of the basal area in a stand. And so it's interesting when you look at a map of the ash basal area in Minnesota, you're really looking at a map of where the forests are in Minnesota because ash is so abundant and so prevalent across our state. This is interesting to look at how abundant ash is relative to how much it's harvested. And so this has a really big impact too when it comes to thinking about options for mitigating damage from EAB. So on the left, we have the total standing volume of all trees in the state, and black ash ranks number 5. But if we look at all of the harvested trees in the state, and not all of the species are the same in both graphs, so there's a few differences, but ash is one of the lowest ranked species that's harvested for wood. And so when we're thinking about potentially using harvesting or silviculture as a tool that might use timber, we have some challenges ahead of us there, given what we know about how much the resource is utilized across the state's forest products industry. Just as a point, ash is widely used in paper mills, sawmills, and as firewood. Its overall consumption is low relative to those other species, but there are at least 2 pulp mills that use it, 100 sawmills, and it's the second most common fuelwood species in Minnesota, at least behind oak. And so there are lots of resources for it and lots of uses for the species, which gives us encouraging news when we're thinking about potentially adapting our forests for an EAB outbreak. A lot of this has come to be, many of you a few years ago maybe had heard of this, maybe were a part of this, what we call the Million Cord Study, or really the Sustainable Timber Harvest Determination that the Minnesota DNR worked on with a consulting group. And as an outcome of that work, they set forth an initiative to harvest an additional 15,000 cords of ash and tamarack wood every year. And so ash, because it's thought to be and is susceptible to the emerald ash borer, tamarack because it's susceptible to the native eastern larch beetle. And so both species are do not have good foresights when it comes to thinking about potential for mortality for those species. And so this initiative is planned each year for the next 5 years. And so this is why it's really important to be thinking about what kind of forest management, what kind of new science is coming on that allows us to say, how can we better adapt our forests in a post-EAB world? And those are a lot of kind of the forest products side of why ash is so important, but also it's incredibly important culturally. It's a very lightweight wood, makes for excellent making of snowshoes, basketry, pack baskets, things like that. It's an incredibly valued resource by a lot of different people. When it comes to thinking about how we manage ash, how we prescribe management prescriptions, we always tell folks to really understand your native plant community. That's really the best source for coming up with management recommendations to come up and to combat emerald ash borer. And so really highlight what the DNR has done with a lot of the native plant communities. Ash is a part of 5 different native plant communities across the state. And these range from really dry, from fire-dependent ecosystems, mesic hardwoods, all the way over to really wet ones like wet forests and peatlands. And so it's really important to understand where ash fits within that native plant community that you might be doing management in, or that you might own that woodland in. However, when we look at those 5 different native plant communities, only a few of them really have a lot of ash. And so this is a graph. We have done some work in the document I'll talk about, published by University of Minnesota Extension, just looking at all of the plots that were used to determine native plant communities and figuring out whether or not an ash tree occurred in those communities or not. And so when we did that, it turns out the floodplain forests, 88% of all the plots that were measured had at least an ash in them. For the wet forest, 75%, and then much lower rates, but the mesic hardwood at about 25%. And so really the ash really dominates these floodplains and wet forests. They are a part of peatlands and fire-dependent ecosystems, but we know just because those systems have other species with them, the peatlands and the fire-dependent communities are not going to have as much risk of EAB compared to our floodplains and our wet forests. Emerald ash borer is currently found in 23 counties, as Jonathan mentioned. This is kind of an animated figure showing the spread as we've begun to monitor it since it started in Minnesota in 2009. And so now we're in the 11th year, and you can see how much it's spread throughout the state. And so when you think about, in particular, where our black ash resource is, really in the northern part of the state, northeast and into the northwest region, we're really thinking about what science is going to be out there that can help us to adaptively manage these systems. As a part of that, University of Minnesota Extension led a process in 2009, really right after EAB was found in Minnesota, to think about how do we manage our forests. And the focus here was really for private landowners. And so this process really consisted of getting a bunch of experts together and kind of finding out, what are the resources, what are the potential replacement tree species, what kinds of things might we do silviculturally that might better adapt our forests to these changes. And so after that, a lot of research happened. A lot of research on looking at what are the differences in water table responses to various harvesting levels in ash forests, what kinds of overstory treatments and silviculture techniques, what do they have on survival of replacement tree species. Marcella Windmuller-Campione at the University of Minnesota, we're involved in a project she's leading that's kind of looking at quantifying regeneration after harvesting. There's a great series of papers in a special issue of the Forest Journal that looked at EAB impacts in ash forests and what's going on there. And so just an incredible millions of dollars really worth of research projects over the last 10 years. And also at the University of Minnesota, we last year updated, and this is a document really for private woodland owners, our managing ash woodlands, our recommendations. And so we kind of took what we started with back in 2009, and then we updated things as we found new tree species maybe didn't survive as well as we thought others did. We updated our documentation there and changed some other things to kind of make it better reflect the science that we know about ash and EAB. One of the common questions a lot of people get that know something about ash forests is, what can I plant? What can I plant that's not an ash tree that might survive well in my ecosystem? And so I really point you to this great paper Tony D'Amato and others wrote a few years ago as a part of that issue in the Forest Journal that looked at not only just species, but also which kinds of stock, whether it's bare root or containerized, which species might be well adapted, survive and grow well in black ash dominated systems. And so this paper separates things out and gives recommendations for the 3 lake states, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and then has some notes about what's worked and what's not worked from many of the research trials that this research team was a part of. And so as an example, they recommend, hackberry in Minnesota forests was a common one that has done well in their research trials. Balsam poplar, swamp white oak, northern white cedar, American elm, of course a disease-resistant version of American elm. And so this is a great paper to read to kind of look at replacement tree species and what that means. We've tried to synthesize that in the Managing Ash Woodlands document, our extension document, just kind of separating out things by native plant community, and also kind of where you are in Minnesota, northern part or the southern part. And so generally a good conifer that works well is northern white cedar, but of course, northern white cedar needs to be protected from deer as a common threat to any cedar you put in the ground. If you're looking at hardwood, we often suggest American elm. Of course, there are lots of disease-resistant American elms now that might be good for planting. And so the document has really, depending on your native plant community, depending on where you are in the state, some options for potential replacement tree species. Looking more kind of less at a site level, but more kind of statewide. I really love the document that the Wisconsin DNR has put together. They've got a great listing of their silviculture guidelines, really some easy to use kind of workflows, depending on your site conditions. They'll kind of take you through and give you a set of options, particularly for folks that are working on state lands. Now, Minnesota has a similar document, but it's not yet been published, but it's coming very soon. And so I have looked at that document too, and I think it's going to be a great resource, particularly for folks that work on state lands, DNR lands, managing ash on those lands. And again, both of these documents from both states do an excellent job of integrating all the science that's come to be here in the last 10 years to say something about how we might manage ash forests, particularly those state-owned lands in both states. I too wanted to point you to the Great Lakes Silviculture Library. This is just a great resource and one that I really suggest, particularly foresters, to submit case studies to. And so there are 4 on the site now that have looked at some element of adaptive management for ash in the face of EAB. And so there's one, I think two from Minnesota and 2 from Wisconsin. One that's a lot of research on EAB has been conducted on, looking at a simulated EAB outbreak on the Chippewa National Forest, and they did that by girdling trees and looking to see, what's the water table rise, how do some of the trees that they planted grow in those different treatments that they did silviculturally. Another one looked at in the floodplain system, looking at ash in that system. 2 from Wisconsin look at how ash interacts with hardwoods. And so one using strip clear cuts that also had some problems with deer browse. Another one looking at converting from hardwoods in another case study. So the Silviculture Library is just a great resource to see what people have done, what's worked, what's not worked when it comes to managing ash. So I guess I'm just going to kind of slowly wrap up here, but just really thinking about, what can you do to minimize the impact of EAB? And I guess if you're a woodland owner, one of the first things we like to suggest is people get an idea of what they've got. And so that's, maybe that's conducting a woodland inventory. Maybe that's, at a start, just getting a map of the property and understanding which trees are on your property. But to somehow assess how much volume of ash you might have in particular and how you might integrate those principles into your management plan to say, to be proactive and to think about managing your lands in the face of EAB. And then, of course, to think about a woodland stewardship plan. So we've got a tool at the University of Minnesota, Find a Forester. You can kind of search by your region and find a forester that can help you write a woodland stewardship plan, or maybe to revise the one you've already got. And so that's a great resource as well. If you're a land manager or natural resource professional, I just encourage you to keep on top of, what's the status and trends of EAB in your area. The Minnesota Department of Ag has a lot of great tools that Jonathan mentioned, especially their mapping tools, which I really like. You can see kind of certainly where the EAB are known. And then I also really encourage you to share what's worked and what's not worked with others. And that's why I think tools like the Silviculture Library are so valuable because they give so much practical advice and they're really transparent. I'd like reading many of those case studies on the Silviculture Library that are really honest. It's like, we tried this, we were expecting this as an objective and a goal, but we didn't get there with what we tried. And oh, by the way, here's why we don't think it worked. And so that's the kind of stuff that never makes it into research articles, never really makes it into so much of what we know, but a tool like the silviculture library can really help in that way. Otherwise, that's really all I've got. I encourage you to, I did share a lot of links. A lot of them are in the slides or in the notes to the slides. I encourage you to visit that short link and get copies of those if you'd like. And otherwise, I'll stop sharing and happy to take any questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. If anyone has questions, type them into the chat. In the meantime, though, we did have a couple when we paused in between presentations. So John or Matt, whoever would like to answer. One was, what has been the ash survival rates in infested areas in Minnesota and other states? And what has been replacing ash in heavily infested areas in Minnesota? I can put that in the chat for you, so that's easier.
Matt, do you want?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take a stab. Yeah, so I mean, the survival rates are not that great. I've heard 99% mortality rates, so it doesn't leave a lot left surviving. So at least for our native species, you know, the black, green, and white ash. In terms of what's replacing them, I really encourage you, and now that I think of it, there was a webinar in this series by Marcella Windmuller-Campione about, you know, what comes up after you might harvest ash. And so that's a great question. A lot of studies are looking at that. And what Marcella's work is really finding is that it's not just ash that's coming back and replacing ash after harvesting. And so we're finding a lot of species, especially like aspen, particularly on the more mesic hardwood sites. So if you think not necessarily those wet or very wet native plant communities, but on the more mesic sites, we can get other species like aspen in particular that does really quite well. And so that's one thing that comes to mind in response to that question.
Great, thank you. Another one from Eric. How effective are chemical treatments offered by tree services?
They're very effective as long as they're applied correctly. So there's a number of different chemicals that you can use, but often if you're treating a kind of a large mature tree, you'll be using what has the chemical emamectin benzoate. And that is extremely effective as long as it's applied correctly. And you need a licensed pesticide applicator to apply it. It's usually done through a systemic injection into kind of that root flare, and it's effective for 2 years, and it is pretty effective into that 3rd year. We do have a guidelines for insecticide use that I will share the link to. That kind of goes through a table of the different chemicals available and what you have. But overall, the best bet if you're trying to treat a high-value tree is to use emamectin benzoate to protect it. I'll get that link.
Perfect. Thanks, John. We have another one. Because of EAB, I harvest all merchantable ash when I do a hardwoods harvest. Good idea?
That's a good, you know, I'm not a silviculturist, so I need to be careful with my wording, but you know, we think about maybe that's a salvage or a pre-salvage condition. Of course, it depends on what other species you have. You know, you're not most of the time salvage operations might be taking a pretty high volume of wood across the stand. Depends on where you are in the state, but I think that's okay to take all. You could also leave some. You know, there's no reason why ash can't be considered a part of diversity. You know, I know it's not ideal. It's not. It's thought to be susceptible. It is susceptible to EAB, but there's no reason to. You could leave some behind to increase some diversity in your stand, at least maybe until EAB might arrive to where you are.
Great. Has there been any research in Minnesota on legacy trees in heavily infested areas?
Nothing that I'm aware of, but not to my knowledge.
There might be I'm trying to remember her name, a national researcher based in Ohio. They're trying to figure out if there's some reason that a small percentage of trees don't succumb or don't get hit. lingering ash is what they call it. And they're looking at that, so we provide locations and we do find them. But they're not really sure if there's any good reason why they just got missed, basically, by the insects. So they are looking into it, but there's no answer yet.
All right, great. Are there quantified impacts to water quality from losing riparian ash stands along surface waters?
Great question. Yeah, I would point you to the water questions. One of the papers by Rob Slezak and others that looked at kind of water table quantity. Now, it didn't talk about quality to my knowledge, and I'm not sure how best to answer that question, but I would point you to that paper by Rob Slezak and others.
Okay, great. And you said that was included in your slide deck, and I can also include that link with the recording when it goes out. So we've still got some time, lots of great questions coming in here. We've got another, to convert an ash swamp to mostly other species, if that has to be done in stages to prevent swamping out, how many decades would that take?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, when you think about, a lot of our mature black ash, large trees, could be well over 100 years old. That's not gonna, you can't just plant trees and expect the water table to go down. So it's an excellent point that it's gonna take some time. I think too, it depends on, so I guess the answer is several decades, 2 to 3 decades maybe, until you can get trees established and growing. I think the key there would be to think about which trees are going to take the place. And so whether that's trees that are already existing, maybe there is some natural regeneration already present that could take off and kind of advance above other trees, but also which trees you might plant. And so kind of having a mix of perhaps trees that are, maybe shade intolerance that are more, that might access the canopy much more quickly than other trees to try to minimize the amount of time that water table might be risen.
Great, and we've got just one more for now. We've got a couple more minutes that some could come in, but what percentage of ash can be harvested without affecting the water table and converting the stand to brush?
That's a great question. Again, I would point folks to that Slezak paper that was I think 5 years ago now or so. So that's a great paper. The key thing there, to talk a little bit about the silviculture methods, it's tough to say percentage of ash, but one of the systems that works really well is the group selection in these black ash dominated stands. And so not necessarily taking out individual trees, but smaller gaps of trees, 1/4 acre to a 1/2 acre in size. And those tends to be pretty good for the water table and not converting it to alder or something that's maybe not of interest in the stand. So I would think about the group selection treatment when it comes to harvesting and water table.
Perfect. I'm not seeing any more for now. So if something else comes in, I'll pass it along. But for now, thank you both, John and Matt. That was really informative and great. There was a lot of great information, a lot of links. For folks that are here, I will compile some of them, some of the new ones that weren't included in the slide deck, I can include with the recording. And also, like Matt said at the end there, like even if something doesn't work, it can be sometimes more important to share that than to share, information on something that did work. It's really important to know, what people have tried so that other folks don't go off and waste resources trying it again in the same place. So definitely share those things on the Silviculture Library or otherwise. And Eli just posted a link there. If you're having some issues downloading that paper that we keep referring to, you can contact Eli. And if there's no more questions, then we will sign off for today. Thank you again, Matt and John, and everyone. Hope to see you again October 20th for our next month's webinar.
Thanks.